This is kind of tight, isn't it?
Today's lesson takes us to 1 Samuel chapter 31 and 2 Samuel chapter 1. Now these are sad chapters because David is mourning the death of King Saul and his best friend Jonathan. Some of us might view a trip to the cemetery as a rather macabre experience. Most people associate a cemetery with the grief that they suffered whenever a loved one was taken from them. And that's understandable since most of us have shed tears at the graves of family and friends. But on an occasional visit to the cemetery actually can be good. It reminds us of our own mortality and the need to make the most of the time that we have. It can also help us appreciate the lives of the people who have gone before us. I mean, after all, a large part of who we are today is a result of the contributions that they made to our lives. Even the people that we didn't appreciate while they were alive may have taught us a valuable lesson or two. Well, Saul had treated David very unjustly, but David went on out of his way to make sure that no harm came to Saul. After all, Saul's death, David could have very easily rejoiced. I mean, after all, Saul had tried to kill him on several occasions, and Saul's death opened the door for him to assume the throne in Israel. But David didn't rejoice when Saul and Jonathan died. Instead, David mourned, and he respected his memory of both Saul and Jonathan. Now, before we actually get into today's scripture passage, I want to go back in time a few years and review some of the events that occurred before these verses were written. Saul was chosen to be the first king of Israel, but Saul wasn't really God's choice for king. God had simply led Israel to the man that best fit what the people wanted and what they thought a king should be like. Since Saul wasn't God's man, he disobeyed God on several occasions, and as a result, Saul found himself out of favor with God. So God tells the prophet Samuel to take a horn filled with oil and to go to Bethlehem and anoint Jesse's son David as the next king of Israel. Well, when Saul heard about it, he wasn't too pleased, so he set out to ignore God and kill David. Now, David had developed a close friendship with Saul's son Jonathan. So on several occasions, Jonathan intervenes on David's behalf and gets his father to promise not to harm David. But this turns out to be an empty promise. All Saul was really trying to do was to get Jonathan to reveal where David was hiding. You see, Saul felt that he was keeping his promise to Jonathan because he had stopped trying to kill David himself. Instead, he tried to hire some hitmen to do it for him. Well, their first attempt came while David was at home, but thanks to the efforts of David's wife, Michal, David escaped. Then David goes to Samuel's house in Ramah, and while he's there, the assassins make 3 attempts to kill David. But God intervenes and no harm comes to David. So Saul figures that it's time to play his ace in the hole. He tells Jonathan to bring David to him. Well, when Jonathan tells David that Saul wants to see him, David tells Jonathan that he can't go there because Saul has been sending hitmen to try to kill him, and apparently Jonathan didn't know this. Well, Jonathan has a little bit of trouble believing that his father is capable of doing this, and after all, Saul had promised Jonathan that he wouldn't harm David. So he assures David that it must be a misunderstanding, so they decide to test Saul. David tells Jonathan to return to Saul without him. And if Saul doesn't get angry, then it will show that David was mistaken and the assassins had not been sent by Saul. But if Saul gets angry with Jonathan for not bringing David to him, then that will be proof that Saul wants David dead. Well, as most of you know, not only did Saul get angry with Jonathan, he also tried to kill Jonathan by throwing a spear at him. So Jonathan warns David to head for the hills, and he does so with Saul hot on his heels. Well, to make a long story short, David has several opportunities to kill Saul, but he didn't. And every time that the opportunity arose, he did something to let Saul know that he had spared Saul's life. Even so, Saul's hatred for David is so great that Saul is still determined to kill him. Well, David escapes, and he forms an alliance with a Philistine king named Achish. Now, Achish ruled from the city of Gath. Can you tell me what was very strange about David to go there to escape? Goliath was from Gath. And we all know that what David did to Goliath. And Goliath had 4 brothers living in Gath that were itching to get their hands on David. That's why David took 5 stones with him when he went out to fight Goliath. Some people feel that David didn't trust God to give him the victory over Goliath, so he took 5 stones just in case he would need them. But that wasn't the reason that he took 5 stones. 1 stone was for Goliath, and the other 4 were reserved for Goliath's 4 brothers. Well, David recognized that Gath probably wasn't the safest place for him to be, so he devises an insurance policy. You see, in the Philistine culture, it was forbidden to harm a person who was insane. So David started acting a little bit goofy so that the Philistines would think that he was insane and leave him alone. Well, as time passed, Achish actually developed a liking for David, and David dropped the act. And he gives David the city of Ziklag to call his very own. Well, David takes his band of 600 men, along with their families, and he moves to Ziklag. Well, while David is there, he starts leading raiding parties against some of Achish's friends. And he takes no prisoners. In other words, he leaves no witnesses. But he always brings the loot home from the raids and gives it to Achish. And he tells Achish that the loot is coming from raids that were from the Israelites who were living in the southern part of Judah. So Achish figures that the Israelites must hate David for raiding their villages, when in fact David was actually raiding Achish's pals. Now Achish sort of likes getting all that loot, so the arrangement goes on for quite some time. I mean, Achish was either too stupid to figure out what was going on, or as long as the loot kept coming in, he just didn't care. Well, it wasn't long before the inevitable happened. The Philistines and the Israelites bump heads, and Achish calls on David to join him in the war against Saul. But God spares David from having to fight Saul. It seems that the other Philistine generals wanted nothing to do with David. I mean, maybe they know where all that loot's coming from. Or maybe they remember what happened to Goliath, and they were afraid that David might turn on them and join the Israelites in the middle of the battle. So David returns to Ziklag. But when he arrives there, he finds the city in ruins, and everybody has been taken prisoner by the Amalekites, including David's family. Well, this shouldn't come as any surprise. I mean, after all, David has been raiding the Amalekites for quite some time now. So David asks God what he should do. And God tells him to go and kick some Amalekite butt. And he does. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, things are not going very well for the Israelites. It seems that Saul's army is losing the battle, and the Israelite soldiers are breaking ranks and running away. 3 of Saul's sons are already dead, and Saul himself has been wounded by an arrow. So Saul realizes that all is lost, and rather than being captured and tortured by the Philistines, Saul tells his armor-bearer to take Saul's sword and kill him with it. But the armor-bearer can't bring himself to kill Saul. So Saul takes the sword and he falls on it, and he kills himself. And the armor-bearer follows suit and does the same thing. Now, David was off killing Amalekites at the time, so he doesn't know that Saul is dead. But 3 days after he returns to Ziklag, a man stumbles into town and he's a mess. He's all dirty and his clothes are in shreds. So David asks him where he had come from. And the man tells David that he had just escaped from the Israelite camp. Well, David figures that this man must know how the battle is going between the Israelites and the Philistines, so he asks, "How did it go? Tell me." Now, have you ever heard those jokes that start out with, "I've got some good news and some bad news"? Well, this situation is sort of like that. I can picture this man saying to David, "I've got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is Israel lost the battle. The good news is your enemy Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. This means that you can now place the crown on your head and rule as king of Israel." At this point, the man produces Saul's crown and bracelet. These are items that David would have been familiar with, so there's no doubt that Saul and Jonathan are dead. Now, this lets us in on the fact that this man knew that David and Jonathan were close friends. Notice that he doesn't even mention the fact that 3 of Saul's other sons have been killed as well. He only mentions Jonathan because he knows that David would be especially interested in hearing about him. Well, David is stunned. So he says, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? And the young man who told him said, by chance I happened to be in the Mount of Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and called to me, and I answered, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? I answered, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, stand behind me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the amulet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. Well, David could have gloated over the fact that Saul was dead. I mean, after all, Saul was the one who had been trying to kill him. Saul's death also opened the door for David to assume the throne, but he didn't gloat. Instead, David grabbed his clothes and ripped them as a sign of grief at the news of Saul's death. And all of his men did the same thing. Then they wept and fasted the rest of the day over the death of Saul and Jonathan. The next morning, David questions the man again. And he begins by asking the man where he was from. Now, David's question in verse 13 is different from the question that he asked in verse 3. In verse 3, he asked the man where he had come from recently. He asked, where do you come from? And he said to him, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. Truth is, he had probably escaped from David when he attacked the Amalekites in order to rescue his family. But in verse 13, David wants to know a little bit about the man's background. So he says, where do you come from? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. Now, did you notice that the story that this man told David may not have been totally true? He said that he found Saul leaning on his spear, asking the Amalekite to kill him. But the first account said that Saul was leaning on his sword, asking his armor bearer to kill him. So if the original account was true, he was trying to take the credit for killing Saul in the hope that David would reward him. Well, it apparently bothered David that this man didn't seem to show any remorse at all over killing Saul. Most likely, the reason that he was in the area of the battle in the first place was so he could loot the dead bodies before the Philistines had a chance to do it. And he apparently knew that Saul had been trying to kill David. So when he stumbled across Saul's body, he figured that if he said that he had killed Saul, and he took Saul's crown and amulet to David as proof, David would be so grateful that he would give him a big reward. Well, David can't help but wonder that if this Amalekite was able to escape, then why didn't he help Saul escape too? But instead he said that he had killed Saul. So he figured that it's possible that the story that this man was telling about how Saul had asked the man to kill him just might be a lie. Maybe Saul had asked the man to help him, but the man killed him anyway in order to steal his crown. Maybe David says to him, how is it that you were not afraid to put your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? But David doesn't even give the man a chance to answer. He tells one of his men to kill the Amalekite on the spot. Now, have you ever heard the expression, who killed Cock Robin? Well, we have a very similar situation here. Who really did kill Saul? Did the Amalekite kill him like 2 Samuel said he did? Or did he take his own life like 1 Samuel said he did? Well, the first thing that you have to ask yourself is this. Was the Amalekite telling the truth? If he was lying, then why was he lying? Maybe he expected David to reward him for killing his old enemy. Personally, I think that the story that the Amalekite told was partially true. And I base that opinion on the verses 9 of 2 Samuel chapter 1. And he, meaning Saul, said to me, stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. If the Amalekite did kill Saul, there is a real irony here. It would be a case of Saul's past sins finally catching up with him. If you'll remember, back in 1 Samuel chapter 15, God had ordered Saul to totally destroy the Amalekites, but he didn't. Instead, Saul disobeyed God, and he only destroyed a part that nobody wanted. All of the best loot and the best people he had spared. This is probably how this man had come to be in the Israelite camp in the first place. He was probably a slave that had been taken during the battle with the Amalekites. And that was the battle where all of the Amalekites should have been killed. But Saul didn't kill all of the Amalekites like God told him to, and it's an Amalekite that kills him. So, how do you explain the two different accounts of Saul's death? Well, many years later, a Jewish historian named Josephus attempted to reconcile the two accounts. He also assumed that the Amalekite had been telling the truth and he was the one who had actually killed Saul. So he explained the events this way. Saul could see that it was hopeless to resist any longer. The Philistine chariots were there and would be there in a few minutes. He had already been wounded by an arrow, so he was in no condition to try to escape. So, not wanting to be captured, Saul asked his armor bearer to kill him. Well, the armor bearer isn't able to do it. He doesn't want to kill Saul. And he tries to commit suicide. So Saul tries to commit suicide by falling on his sword. Well, the armor bearer sees that Saul has committed suicide and falls on his own sword and dies. The problem is, in his weakened condition, Saul didn't have the strength to force the sword into his body far enough to cause a fatal wound. Well, when the Amalekite came upon Saul, he's leaning against a spear that he had stuck into the ground. He is badly wounded and he isn't dead yet. And the Philistines are getting closer. So he asked the Amalekite to finish the job for him. Well, the Amalekite is a prisoner of war, so he is more than happy to oblige Saul. Then, after he kills Saul, he takes Saul's crown and bracelet and he heads off to find David, expecting to be rewarded for killing who he thought was David's enemy. But the plot backfires on him. David recognizes the fact that the Amalekite wasn't sorry at all that Saul was dead. David also knows that God had judged the Amalekites and that they were to be destroyed, so David obeys God and he has him executed. At this point, in response to the news of Saul's death, David writes a song of lamentation for the two men that he loved the most, Saul and Jonathan. And that brings us to today's scripture. As we go through life, there are certain things that all of us must experience. We are all born. We all have to live within the limits placed on us by our physical bodies. And if the Lord tarries, we must all die someday. There is nothing in life that is more certain than death. I mean, doctors have do some pretty amazing things today in order to prolong life. But the ultimate outcome always remains the same. Sooner or later, everybody dies. Or at least their body dies. Now, if you ask people today if they're afraid to die, most of them will tell you that they aren't. We've all come to the realization that there's just no way to avoid it. But what they do fear is the process of dying. You see, it's not the destination that they fear. It's the trip there that they fear. But if they don't know Jesus, they should fear the destination too. Unfortunately, most unsaved people don't see hell as being all that bad. John Newton was once a slave trader. But after he became a Christian, he went on to become one of the greatest preachers and hymn writers that the Church of England ever had. Well, just before his death in 1807, he was so weak that he had to have someone hold him up in the pulpit so he could preach. Now, that is a dedicated preacher. This is what he said in the sermon about his approaching death. He said, "I am like a person going on a journey in a stagecoach who expects to arrive every hour and is frequently looking out the window for it. I am packed and I'm ready for the post." You may not know Newton as well as you know some of the words he wrote. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Well, I suppose that the first thing that we need to see in the scripture passage is the fact that David did grieve over Saul and Jonathan. Even though David was a godly man, there was no way to insulate him from feeling sorrow. In fact, it was his faith in God that actually helped him express his grief. I mean, after all, two of the people that he loved dearly were dead, and David expressed his grief openly. Well, why not? I mean, grief is a natural thing. In certain situations, it's actually expected of us. We get suspicious of a widow who shows no grief at all over the death of her husband. But in spite of that fact, there are a lot of people who seem to feel that if we just have enough faith, we can somehow sidestep grief. They feel that we should be able to console ourselves with some sort of religious reassurance that will remove all the pain. And then we should be able to face the situation with a smile on our face. And to that idea, I say horse hockey. It's important for us to see that David did grieve for Saul and Jonathan. After all, grief is probably the only emotion that every one of us will experience at some point in our lives. I mean, most people will even grieve over the death of a pet. I mean, grief is common to all of us. There's a story about a woman in ancient China who was devastated by the loss of her son. She finally went to see a very wise man, and she asked him if he could bring her son back. The wise man said, "Woman, I will restore your son to you, and the price is only a few mustard seeds, but those mustard seeds must come from a house that has never seen grief." Well, she searched far and wide, but every house that she came to had suffered the loss of a loved one. She finally realized that grief is universal and that no one escapes it. Even so, today's society seems to be very intolerant of grief. I think it comes from the fact that grief is so universal that we just don't want to be reminded of it. So we feel uncomfortable around people who are grieving. This is why many new widows say that as soon as their spouse dies, their friends abandon them. My father died when he was 58 years old, and that meant that my mother became a widow at the relatively young age of 55. So she wasn't an old woman by any means. But she told me that the first couple of weeks after the funeral, she never heard from anybody. My brother and I both lived out of the state, so we were just limited to the occasional phone call. But that's not the same as a face-to-face meeting. You see, they were all couples, and they didn't want to be bothered with a grieving widow. So they just dropped her. All of us have tried to comfort people who are grieving, and most of the time the common response is, "I didn't know what to say." Well, as Christians, we seem to feel that we have a responsibility to come up with this magic formula that will end the grief. And we probably feel it that way because their grief makes us uncomfortable. So the sooner we can end it, the better off we'll feel. So we've offered Bible verses, or we'll throw out some cliches like life must go on or time heals all wounds. I remember talking to one woman who had just lost her husband. She said, "I hope as time passes that this grief will go away." I told her, I said, "Your grief will never go away totally. I said, you will never forget your husband. I would think less of you if the grief did go away." So for the rest of your life, every time something happens that reminds you of your husband, you're going to feel some grief. But as time passes, God will give you the strength to cope with your loss. You'll be able to smile again and just cherish the good memories. You see, we try to do our best to eliminate the pain of losing a loved one. And even though those efforts are well-intentioned, sometimes they're misguided. The fact is, in most cases, it's probably better to just keep your mouth shut and let them do the talking. What most people need most is a sympathetic shoulder to cry on. We've conditioned people to think that they have to reach a point where they never think of their loved one again. And they feel guilty when they find out that they just can't do that. The grief needs to run its course. People need to let God help them cope with the grief so that it doesn't escalate to an unhealthy level. And the best way that we can help is to just allow the grieving person to use us as a sympathetic ear where they can express their grief rather than trying to hide it. And all we need to do is to be good listeners and only offer advice when we're asked for it. Eric Robert Albendinger died after only living about 14 days. His parents wrote these words after his passing. "For us, Good Friday came early. With Sue holding him in her arms, Eric just stopped breathing, and no amount of CPR by us or the paramedics or the hospital staff could bring him back. A sudden and fatal cardiac arrest, and Eric was gone. No warning, and as of yet, no reason why. How did God feel when his only son died on the cross? Maybe none of us will ever know, but we think that we have an inkling as to what he must have felt. We watched helplessly as that beautiful bit of God's creation turned limp, gray, and lifeless in our arms. There was stark raving fear as we heard the words of death. And there was the agony of fear we now feel. Those feelings hurt more than anything we have ever experienced. But in the long run, it is the foundation, the rock, the faith upon which our lives rest that counts. And we affirm that the rock is strong. It is holding us from being swept away by anger, fear, resentment, and grief. The rock of Jesus Christ will always be there as our foundation. In an attempt to explain why these tragic things happen, many people say the most heretical and damaging things. Some will say that God took Eric, that God needed him more than we did. I wonder then, how could we pray to a supposedly loving God who killed our child? Some will say that God is trying to get through to us. Well, that seems to be a strange way to get to our attention. Couldn't he have used a subtler way? Some will say that God is trying to teach us a lesson. We would like to know what lesson requires the death of a child. Some will say that God is punishing us, that we did something wrong. If that were true, then there would be no children left on earth, or who among us can claim exemption from God's wrath? Some will say that God is testing us. If that is the case, we flunked the test because we haven't found a person yet who has the answer. Those things are simply not true. Our Lord has done none of those things. God is not in the business of creating a perpetual evil and destruction. Eric is dead, and I am convinced that God is even now grieving with us. The rock is strong. He is holding us firm. Our faith has not wavered or dimmed. The pain and grief of Eric's death is still there, but we give witness that Jesus Christ, rock of our salvation, is the only foundation that works, the only one that lasts forever. So whenever I find myself faced with someone who is going through that sort of situation, I don't say very much at all. I try to show them that grieving is okay. And I never make any attempts to second guess what God has in mind. Unfortunately, there are many people who feel guilty whenever they find themselves grieving. That's especially true for men. They feel that somehow expressing grief is a sign of weakness. They feel that somehow expressing grief shows that they don't have enough faith. So I try to make them understand that it's okay to hurt. Now, how grief manifests itself is different from person to person. So don't expect everyone to handle grief in the same way that you would. That's why I say that it's best to say as little as possible and let them tell you how they feel and what they need. Now understand this, the grieving process will never really stop. You will always feel the loss of a loved one. But the feeling of grief will in time reach the point where you can function in spite of it. You will be able to laugh again. There will come a day when your grief will no longer dominate your every thought, and you shouldn't feel guilty when that day arrives. It's okay to let your life go on, but sometimes we as bystanders try to speed up that process too much. But most of the time we really don't do that to help the grieving person. We do it mostly for our own benefit. You see, we tend to want to get their grieving over with as soon as possible so that we don't have to deal with it anymore. And in many cases, we aren't even aware of the fact that we're doing it for that reason. Deep down, our acts are well-intentioned. We see this person hurting, and we want to make the hurt go away, and that's sort of commendable. But the pain that we feel is just our spirit's way of letting us know that, hey, this is serious. The point is, we can't ignore the reality of grief. And we also need to recognize the fact that grief does have some therapeutic value. And even though its benefits are limited to helping us accept the status quo, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We also need to remember that grief is not a sign of weakness. In fact, it's actually a sign of strength. It shows us that we are accepting the reality of our loss. You see, weakness would deny the pain, or it might try to artificially cover it up with alcohol and drugs or something else. So grieving is actually a sign of strength. As strong a person as David was, you don't see him trying to hide the fact that he felt pain over the loss of his friends. He wasn't saying, well, I guess it's God's will. He wasn't denying that was true. He knew that it was God's will, but he grieved and hurt anyway. It's very clear that David cared a lot about Saul and Jonathan, so showing grief over their death was a natural thing to do. Giving love and friendship to another person has great rewards, but it also carried with it a great risk. The more intimately involved you are with another person's life, the greater the loss is felt when that relationship is broken. So far in my life, I have buried 3 fathers. Obviously, only one of them was my biological father, but I cared enough about the other 2 that I felt some pain. True friendship takes commitment. It requires time to develop. It requires caring to keep it alive, and sometimes it requires pain. But true friendship is willing to make that sort of investment, and is also willing to take that sort of risk. The reality is we have family and friends that we care very much about. They are people that we have invested a part of ourselves in, and some of them are going to die before we do. So we need to be prepared to grieve. Now, because there is a risk involved in loving people, I don't want you to leave here today and break all ties with your family and friends. Family and friends are important, and true friends will be there for you no matter what. And whenever that sort of relationship is broken, for any reason, we will feel the pain. One of the most beautiful friendships in the Bible is the friendship between David and Jonathan. David even commented in verse 26, "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women." That's a significant statement when you consider the fact that David was married to Jonathan's sister Michal. Michal started out as a very loving wife, but she went on to betray David. But Jonathan's friendship was true to the very end. These 2 men were not fair weather friends. Their friendship was strong during the good times, but it was even stronger to survive the bad times as well. There's a statue in Budapest, Hungary that carries the inscription, "When the weather is fine, you have many friends. When the skies are cloudy, you will be alone." Real friendships, like the friendship between Jonathan and David, will stay strong even when it gets cloudy. Psychologists seem to like to use the term grief work, and that's exactly what it feels like, work. Mary Sarton explained it this way in an article she wrote titled "Recovery." The only way through pain is through it. To absorb, to probe, to understand exactly what it is and what it means. To close the door of pain is to miss the chance for growth. Even the most terrible shock has somehow to be built into the fabric of our personality. Sometimes we need to ask ourselves this question: exactly who is it that benefits from the funeral? It's a good question. Yeah. And until we can answer that question, we can't help anybody else through it. Now, it's obvious that the funeral won't benefit the person who died, so it has to be meant for the family and friends of the deceased. After all, they're the ones who are suffering the most pain. But aren't funerals really meant for all of us? Every one of us is either grieving, preparing to grieve, or dealing with past grief. Remember, grief is the most universal emotion we have. So, in that sense, every funeral is for every one of us. Ernest Hemingway wrote, "For whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." We are all involved in grief work. And this is where the Christian community can help prepare for grief. Now, talking about funerals, there are 2 ways to approach them. They can be very sad occasions. Most funerals that I've attended in my lifetime seem to be designed to make the person that's there feel as miserable as possible. I've always wondered if that was supposed to ease any guilt people may feel because they didn't treat the deceased person very well when they were alive. So when they're dead, they feel that the least they can do is feel miserable when they're gone. The benefit is it helps the family feel better to know that other people miss their loved one as much as they do. Now, I spent a lot of time in my childhood years living in North Carolina, and the black community near where I lived handled funerals in a very different way. They threw a party. They would have a band, and everyone in the funeral party would parade through the streets dancing to the music. Then they would have a big dinner afterwards. Funerals were joyous occasions. That custom continued until the 1950s, but has gone the way of the dinosaur today. It actually got started before the Civil War among black slaves in the South. They grieved over the loss of their loved one, But they also celebrated the fact that their loved one was now in heaven and was no longer a slave. And that was a good reason to throw a party. But when the slavery ended, that custom gradually faded away, and we don't see parties at funerals anymore. You know, fewer and fewer people go to funerals today. Sometimes it's due to the distances that separate families today. We have become a very fragmented society. Years ago, most people never ventured very far away from where they were born. But today, family members are scattered all over the country, and they rarely, if ever, even talk to one another. The fact is, most of us don't even know the name of our next door neighbor. And since neighbors don't want to get involved, more and more people are left to face the grief alone. This removes the outlet for grief. And when grief turns inward, it will always manifest itself in illness, anger, depression, or some other self-destructive way. For example, did you know the husbands whose wives have died suddenly by accident or violence are 66 times more likely to commit suicide? A woman's chances of having a heart attack are 600% greater when the first 6 months of suffering the loss of a family member. The heart attack rate among men who have lost their wives is 1,000% higher than it is among married men of the same age. You see, people do die of a broken heart, but the grieving process is what lets us vent those emotions, and any loss creates many emotions. First, we feel the sense of loss, we feel sadness, but we can also feel a sense of abandonment, even anger. I mean, after all, we've invested a lot of time and energy into this relationship. I mean, how could they have left us behind? Sometimes we even resent it. A grieving person should not be made to feel guilty about their emotions. We need to vent them. In this way, our grieving can help us accept the reality of the loss, and we can get on with our lives even sooner. Now, as sort of a footnote here, as Christians, it's also important for us to think about how we might react to the death of someone that we weren't particularly friendly with. In other words, someone that we didn't particularly like. For example, most of us can remember exactly where we were on November 22nd, 1963, when the news of the assassination of John F. Kennedy came out. Well, there was a seminary professor who was known for his great dislike of John Kennedy, and when he overheard a couple of students talking about it, he said, "Someone should have done it a long time ago." Well, after he said that, he regretted it. Word spread across the campus about that crass remark, and the professor was forced to make a public apology. But are we sometimes tempted to do the same thing when we hear about the death of someone that we don't particularly get along with? Our humanness wants to say, good, he got what he had coming to him. Many years ago, I read about a pastor who kept a book on his desk that was titled Complaints of Members Against Other Members. Whenever someone would come into the office and complain about another member, he would pick up the book and he would say, "Okay, I'll write down what you just said, and you can sign it, and that way I'll remember what testimony you're going to give when I bring the action up later." Of course, the first reaction was, "I can't sign something like that." And then they run out of the office as fast as their legs will carry them. That pastor had that book on his desk for over 40 years. And even after 40 years, every page on that book was blank. It's so easy for us to strike out against someone we don't like. It would have been very easy for David to have struck out against Saul. I mean, David even had several occasions to kill Saul. I mean, after all, Saul tried to kill him. And Saul's death meant that David could now assume the throne. You would think that David would be doing cartwheels all over the place when he heard that Saul was dead. But David chose not to remember the bad things about Saul. He only remembered the good things. Let's try to only remember the good things. Okay, now that we understand that there is an investment and a risk in all relationships, and we understand the importance of grief work, we now need to address the role that both God and His church play in the grieving process. First and foremost, we need to understand this. God does not take away the pain of the loss, but His presence does help us deal with it. As Christians, we are God's agents here on earth. And as God's agents, we have an obligation to reach out to those who are hurting. I mean, after all, someday they are going to be us. Paul tells us that Christians don't grieve like non-Christians do. But we do not want to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. Why? Because we have hope, but we do still grieve. One thing about our faith in Christ will remove that pain from us. In fact, knowing that how dearly God feels about every life and knowing how God agonizes over every person will actually help us grieve. And even though knowing that God is there with us won't eliminate the pain, but it will make it easier for us to bear. Why? Because Christians view death differently than non-Christians do. Remember, we have hope. They don't. For the Christian, death is the last shadow before heaven's dawn. Paul wrote, yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body than at home with the Lord. Victor Hugo once wrote, when I go down to the grave, I can say like so many others, I have finished my work, but I cannot say I have finished my life. My day's work will begin the next morning. My tomb is not a blind alley, it is a thoroughfare. It closes in the twilight to open in the dawn. Friends, trust me when I tell you this. We are not residing in the land of the living. We are residing in the land of the dying. But someday we are going to go to the land of the living. That's heaven. In the meantime, we must think of death like an old Scotsman who said, it matters little to me whether I live or die. If I die, I will be with Jesus. If I live, Jesus will be with me. One of life's toughest challenges is learning how to grieve. There are those who will tell us that we need to be brave because of our Christian faith and hope. In other words, they tell us not to show any sorrow at all. Then there are those who say that openly grieving is good therapy. Well, today's lesson teaches us that grieving over the loss of a loved one is okay. In fact, David's funeral song for Saul and Jonathan suggests that the grieving process is a part of God's healing process. It's safe to say that no one gets any extra points for refusing to show any sorrow over a personal loss. The nobleness of David's character is seen in the fact that he refused to gloat over Saul's death, in spite of the fact that Saul had been trying to kill him. We also feel sorrow over the death of people that we don't particularly like. At the very least, we can show sympathy for that person's family and friends who are grieving, and that's especially true when the deceased person hasn't come to Christ for salvation. David chose to look at the good things about Saul and to ignore the times when Saul wasn't acting like he should have been acting. It takes great courage on the part of to lay aside the hurts of and the hatreds and to respect the positive side of that person. And that's especially true if that person happens to be an enemy. We're also encouraged by the fact that David was willing to mourn so openly for Saul and Jonathan. He wasn't afraid to express how he felt. Losing a loved one is a hard thing to cope with, and I'm not telling you that it isn't. But with God's help and the support of family and friends, we can all do it.